Story time. And this is the story of a real life superhero, and his name was Frederick Douglas. So let's start the story. In 1833, Mr. Thomas Auld, the slaveholding owner of a plantation on Maryland's eastern shore, summoned back his slave Frederick Douglas, 15 years old at that time, from Baltimore, where Douglas had just spent 7 years serving Auld's brother. Now he was needed to work the fields of the plantation, but life in the city had changed Douglas in many ways, and to his chagrin he found it quite hard to disguise this from Auld. In Baltimore he had secretly managed to teach himself how to read and write, something no slave was allowed to do, for that would stimulate dangerous thoughts. On the plantation, Douglas tried to teach as many slaves as possible to read. These efforts were quickly squashed. But what was worse for him was that he had developed a rather defiant attitude, what the slaveholder called impudence. He talked back to Auld, questioned some of his orders, and played all kinds of tricks to get more food. Auld was notorious for keeping his slaves near starvation. One day, Auld informed Douglas that he was hiring him out for a year to Mr. Edward Covey, a nearby farm renter who had earned a reputation as a consummate breaker of young Negroes. Slaveholders would send him their most difficult slaves, and in exchange for their free labor, Covey would beat every last ounce of rebellion out of them. Covey worked Douglas especially hard, and after a few months he was broken in body and spirit. He no longer desired to read books or engage in discussion with his fellow slaves. On his days off, he would crawl under the shade of a tree and sleep off his exhaustion and despair. One especially hot day in August 1834, Douglas became ill and fainted. The next thing he knew, Covey was hovering over him, hickory slab in hand, ordering him back to work. But Douglas was too weak. Covey hit him on the head, opening a deep wound. He kicked him a few times, but Douglas could not move. Covey finally left, intending to deal with him later. Douglas managed to get to his feet, staggered to the woods, and somehow made his way back to Auld's plantation. There he begged with Master Auld to keep him there, explaining Covey's cruelty. Auld was unmoved. Douglas could spend the night, but then must return to Covey's farm. Making his way back to the farm, Douglas feared the worst. He told himself that he would do his best to obey Covey and somehow survive the weeks ahead. Arriving at the stables where he was supposed to work that day, he began his chores, when out of nowhere, like a snake, Covey slithered in, rope in hand. He lunged at Douglas, trying to get a slip knot on his leg and tie him up. He was clearly intending the thrashing to end all thrashings. Risking an even more intense beating, Douglas pushed Covey away and, without hitting him, kept him from getting the rope around his leg. At that moment, something clicked in Douglas's head. Every defiant thought that had been suffocated by his months of brutal labor came back to him. He was not afraid. Covey could kill him, but it was better to go down, fighting for his life. Suddenly a cousin came to Covey's aid, and finding himself surrounded, Douglas did the unthinkable. He swung hard at the man and knocked him to the ground. Hitting a white man would most likely lead to his hanging. A fighting madness came over Douglas. He returned Covey's blows. The struggle went on for 2 hours until, bloodied, exhausted, and gasping for breath, Covey gave up and slowly staggered back to his house. Douglas could only assume that Covey would now come after him with a gun or find some other way to kill him. It never happened. Slowly it dawned on Douglas. To kill him or punish him in some powerful way posed too great a risk. Word would get out that Kavi had failed to break a Negro this one time, had had to resort to a gun when his terror tactics did not work. The mere hint of that would ruin his reputation far and wide, and his job depended on his perfect reputation. Better to leave the wild 16-year-old slave alone than risk the kind of crazy or unpredictable response Douglas had showed himself capable of. Better to let him calm down and go quietly away when his time of service there was over. For the rest of Douglas's stay with Kavi, the white man did not lay a hand on him. Douglas had noticed that slaveholders often prefer to whip those who are most easily whipped. Now he had learned the lesson for himself. Never again would he be submissive. Such weakness only encouraged the tyrants to go further. He would rather risk death, returning blow for blow with his fists or his wits. Interpretation. Reflecting on this moment years later in his book, My Bondage and My Freedom, after he had escaped to the North and become a leading advocate of the abolitionist movement, Douglas wrote, "This battle with Mr. Kavi was the turning point in my life as a slave. I was a changed being after that fight. I had reached the point at which I was not afraid to die. This spirit made me a free man, in fact, while I remained a slave in form." For the rest of his life, he adopted this fighting stance. By being unafraid of the consequences, Douglas gained a degree of control of his situation, both physically and psychologically. Once he had rooted fear out of himself, he opened up possibilities for action, sometimes fighting back overtly, sometimes being clever and deceitful. From a slave with no control, he became a man with some options and some power, all of which he leveraged into real freedom when the time came. To control the dynamic, you must be able to control yourself and your emotions. Getting angry and lashing out will only limit your options. And in conflict, fear is the most debilitating emotion of all. Even before anything has happened, your fear puts you on your heels, cedes the initiative to the enemy. The other side has endless possibilities for using your fear to help control you, keep you on the defensive. Those who are tyrants and domineering types can smell your anxiety, and it makes them even more tyrannical. Before anything else, you must lose your fear of death, of the consequences of a bold maneuver, of other people's opinion of you. That single moment will suddenly open up vistas of possibilities, and in the end, whichever side has more possibilities for positive action has greater control.